Hi, thank you so much for coming to the English Department Lecture Series at the University of Georgia. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Amrita Ghosh, who will join as Assistant Professor of English at Central Florida University in fall 2022. She's a research fellow currently at the South Asia Center, Lund University, Sweden, working on fault lines of South Asia, in which she studies cultural and literary productions from the borderlands of South Asia and the conflict zone of Kashmir. Ghosh has been a full-time lecturer at Seton Hall University for a very long time. She's a visiting lecturer at Linnaeus University in Sweden. She is also finishing a monograph on Kashmir titled Kashmir's Necropolis, New Literature and Visual Texts. And she's the editor of Tagore and Yeats, a post-colonial revisioning, coming out next month with Brill in Netherlands. And that's the subject of our talk today. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Amrita Ghosh. However, I would like to introduce Amrita Ghosh also because her work personally means a lot to me. I grew up in the state of Assam, one of the borderland states in Northeast India, that have been waging an armed, bloody secessionist war against the Indian government since 1979. Growing up in the 80s and 90s in small town Assam, our lives were very different from the children who were in the other parts of India. We call the rest of India mainland India because the northeastern states of India are connected to the main landmass of India through a 22-mile narrow stretch of land called the Chicken Snake. Living beyond the Chicken Snake meant that everything reached Assam and other northeastern states late from mainland India. We received our national dailies a day late. Our couriers were slow. Our mobile phones that worked in mainland India didn't work in Northeast India because of quote unquote security reasons. Finally, we were also governed by a different set of laws since 1958 called AFSPA. The Indian constitution wasn't followed when it came to ruling the unruly tribes of Northeast India. All of this has led to the growth of a massive outpouring of new English language writing in Northeast India that is uniquely different from what the world consumes as Indian English writing. Literature from Northeast India that voices many of the concerns I have raised now is a new and exciting area of scholarly inquiry in post-colonial studies. In 2004, when I moved to Delhi to study literature at Delhi University, I realized that similar concerns echo in writings emerging from Kashmir and other marginal communities of the country. In a sense, we were all responding to state violence, the failure of the state, the impermanent state, the fragile and erratic presence of democracy formed the crux of a lot of our writings. Dr. Amrita Ghosh studies, supports, and teaches this kind of writing, which is radical, new, and subversive. Another reason why I feel Dr. Ghosh's work is very exciting is because in popular depictions of India circulating in mainly the US and the US academia, we rarely see the stories that the nation's jingoistic governments have shoved under the carpet. These are stories of massive human rights violations committed by the Indian state in the country's margins. Dr. Ghosh's forthcoming book actually addresses many of these concerns, as I mentioned, and she also, where she examines the depictions of people or unequal citizens who have lived through the violence that India has committed on the borderlands. There are many post-colonial scholars from India, almost all over all the major universities in the world, but few are studying these, hitherto underrepresented literary traditions. Only a small but growing number of scholars have addressed or have started addressing these topics. These topics are slowly gaining centrality in post-colonial studies, shedding their earlier marginality. So as India romances religious fanaticism and goes in a nosedive, people have started to wonder, and who read Indian literature have been wondering what went wrong, But the truth is nothing went wrong. In the margins, it was always like this. Writers have been writing about these in their novels, poems, short stories. Scholars such as Dr. Ghosh would have a very central role to play in leading these discussions and shaping the public and scholarly conversations in years to come. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Ghosh, I also want to say that Dr. Ghosh is an excellent visionary editor of a beautiful online literary magazine called Celebration that counts stalwarts such as Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Bapsi Sidwa among its regular readers because they are part of the advisory board. And in fact, 10 years ago, that's how I got acquainted with Dr. Ghosh. She asked me to contribute a short story, and I was very delighted to do that. And here we are in 2022, still having conversations, similar kind of conversations, more mature conversations, more engaging conversations. And I'm very excited that I was able to create this opportunity. Dr. Amrita Ghosh, over to you.
I don't know where to begin with that absolutely amazing introduction. I don't know if I deserve that, but I'm very honored and delighted to be here today. Professor Kashyap has been a colleague and a friend, and more than my work, I think his work and writings is something that deserves a kind of new direction that he talked about in Indian Anglophone writing and writings coming out from the Indian subcontinent that pushes these boundaries. I almost want to talk about his writings now and Kashmir instead of what we have to do. But I think the reason that I came to this really fascinating space that Professor Kashyap has created and Professor Santaso has welcomed in her class is because these conversations are necessary. I thank you all for being here today. Some of the colleagues I see on Zoom, thank you for being here today. And thank you to the class for having me in your very special classroom space, even though I'll be through Zoom. Also, final thank you to the English department at University of Georgia, without whose support this could not have been possible. So thanks to everybody. What I want to do today is talk about why Tagore and Yeats. And this project began before I moved to Sweden in 2017, 5 years ago. And there was a concern about Tagore being completely obscured in so many different ways. I had been to a conference in the US in Colorado where people obviously knew who W.B. Yeats was, but very few in the audience, scholarly audiences, had to uncover Tagore as the writer, the artist. So this project began from there, and obviously the book is coming out this month in actually 2 weeks' time. And I want to divide the talk into two separate sections. The first section, albeit they will be connected, the first section I will focus on Tagore and Yeats' mercurial friendship and frame it within this politics of friendship, representation, colonialism, concerns that still matter to us today, even if these writers are long gone. They are almost, somebody said to me recently, there is a wave of reading Tagore again. What does that mean? And W.B. Yeats has been, both of them have been co-opted and misrepresented and represented in so many different ways within political regimes and by governments. So it really is necessary to bring them back in a conversation and dialogue. So that's the first part, that we will delve into this notion of imperfect alliances, critical intimacies, or lack thereof in both the writers. And then the second part, I will focus on modernism's art and the modalities of different kinds of artistic creations and collaborations in Tagore and Yeats. Tagore especially is considered, or his art is not so much studied. It's hugely underrepresented or understudied area. Over 2,000 paintings exist currently. So I focus on that. And then in the final section, I move to Yeats and his collaboration with Japanese artist, performer, Nishio Ito. And I argue that both of their modernisms situate in Tagore a grotesque modernism, and in Yeats this kind of emergence of an intermedial modernism. And I'm of course going to talk about these terms later. So I started in 1912, a long time ago, which was a pivotal time in Western modernism, and also a time when Tagore and Yeats met for the first time in what came to be known famously as the Tagore Evening. This was in Hampstead, organized by artist William Rothenstein. And after this so-called Tagore Evening, Rabindranath Tagore was officially launched into the Western literary circuit. And then there was a sudden furor about Tagore in newspapers and magazines. People started talking about this sage-like poet, this mystic, so on and so forth. It was not the first time, though, that Tagore had come to the UK, and it was actually twice before that he had been to London, first time to study as early as in the age of 17, and then later on. But this meeting in 1912 was then touted as the discovery, in very problematic terms, of the writer. During the same time, in the Indian subcontinent, Tagore was a very eminent name. And obviously, those of you in the audience know Tagore. He's a cult celebrity figure, sometimes problematically so, within a certain class of Bengali population. Almost this kind of, there's this famous saying that for every mood or every moment, there is a Tagore song that can be associated. And, you know, that's a popular kind of popularity of Tagore. And of course, he's also the writer of both India and Bangladesh, Bangladesh's national anthem. But during this time that this was going on and the discovery, so to speak, of Tagore, he was a key figure critiquing British imperialism, starting to formulate a kind of critique of nationalism that grows fierce as the years go by. Albeit within certain kinds of nuances and complexities, he is a very complex thinker. It's hard to sometimes pin down Tagore because he modifies his thinking. So, and also his gender, his questions about gender, his depictions about women in his works are something that I'm really, that's something that I would like to work on more. This volume does not give that kind of primacy to that. So all of this is curiously occluded or sometimes completely erased when we think about this 1912 meeting and eventually what happened in this kind of essentializing of Tagore. On 7 July 1912, Tagore's physical presence was something that was very important, oddly enough. He was codified in a certain orientalized vision. After this particular evening, British poet Francis Cornford stated, and I'm quoting Cornford, "He's like a saint, and the beauty and dignity of his whole being, which is wonderful to remember. I can now imagine a powerful and gentle Christ, which I could never before." W.B. Yeats, after this meeting, said, and I'm quoting, "Meeting Tagore was one of the greatest events of my artistic life." End quote. Poet Sturge Moore, who obviously championed Tagore in his endeavors at that point, mentioned, quoting, "Yeats and Rothenstein had a Bengali poet in view. During the last days I was in London. The poet himself is a sweet creature, beautiful to the eye, in silk turban. He likes Keats and Wordsworth, best of English poetry, has read everything, including my work," end quote. And as we note, most of the writers focus on Tagore's look, and also there's this garnering of approval that he's well-read, not only in the English grades, but of course, Moore says himself too in that. Much later, after Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913, after a heavy backing by Yeats, Tagore travels to Sweden twice in 1921 and 1926, a space where I'm speaking from geographically, as well as other parts of Scandinavia. Very well-known Swedish explorer, Sven Hedin, received Tagore as a guest during this first visit, and I'm quoting him from this first visit. "The young Rabindranath could sit motionless for hours in his garden and meditate in deep devotion. Squirrels scampered over his shoulders and morning birds sat on his head and knees," end quote. There was this forwarding of this kind of spiritual sage-like image, and that, as many of the scholars in Tagore studies have talked about, reduces him in very big ways that we will get into shortly. During the same visit, Swedish Archbishop Nathan Söderblom writes about Tagore in his book that came out shortly, quoting, "He's a man of ideals in both body and soul. Pure air surrounds him." I actually don't know what that means. Sorry. When he stood there and intoned his address in a high and delicate falsetto, his like India's bards and sacrificial priests, he appeared so unworldly, and his manners were so ceremonial, deliberate, and measured that one felt completely surprised to feel his communicativeness and enthusiasm when talking to him privately. End quote. Immediately after, Svenska Dagbladet, one of the most serious newspapers in Sweden, published a report by Marta Lindqvist, popular journalist at the time, quoting, Tagore makes very few movements. Mostly he sits motionless in his armchair with his arms on their armrests, his head raised, but his eyes looking downwards. At times, he looks behind his gold-rimmed eyeglasses, the only Western aspect of his appearance. And one can meet the gaze of the sparkling dark eyes, mild, beautiful, and expressive. His skin is remarkably light. He looks like a sunburned white man. His features are pure and noble. The impression one gains from a fleeting meeting with Tagore is that of a pure idealist and dreamer. The resemblance to Christ in his face and character naturally contributes to this. End quote. I want to take a pause here quickly and share with you, at the same time, in 1912, when all of this representation is going on, and slightly after in Sweden, William Rothenstein meets Tagore, not in London, but in his Jurashako native home near Calcutta. And he is interested, he gets enamored by the presence of Tagore again and draws a series of paintings representing Tagore. And I think my screen sharing is disabled. If I can quickly show, thank you. Thank you, Aruni. So this is Tagore as a young man, if you can see my screen. And this is something obviously not the later Tagore that we have a sort of dominant representation of, but I like the photo. But here are some of the paintings done by Rothenstein in 1912. This is, I know this is slightly hazy, the scan did not come out well. This one was done in 1912 representing Tagore. This one also from the same series of portraits by Rothenstein. This one has a signature from 1912 also, and then the final one by him. And the reason I'm showing you this is because what we just heard in terms of the British poets, Sturge Moore, Conford, Yeats himself, and the artistic depictions all kind of compare him to this Christ-like figure, this sage-like, unworldly creature. There's this strange otherness kind of space that he's relegated to immediately. So it really shapes a certain framing of Tagore in various ways. Yeats' own introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali that ultimately, I'll stop the screen share here and I'll come back to the artwork when I'm there again. Yeats' own introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali that ultimately catapulted the latter into international fame and eventually to the Nobel Prize was not without problems. In the introduction, and there have been a lot of work done on the introduction itself within post-colonial criticism, but there is this moment that Tagore talks about, Yeats talks about Tagore as Mr. Tagore, like the Indian civilization itself, has been content to discover soul and surrender himself to spontaneity. There is an end quote. So there's this mythic exoticization of Tagore in all these kinds of Eurocentric narratives that we see, almost outside time, outside history. And another telling line from Yeats's introduction is a whole people, a whole civilization immeasurably strange to us seems to have taken up in this imagination, and yet we are not moved because of its strangeness, but because we have met our own image. End quote. After Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913, English literary crowds expressed their disappointment, especially due to the fact that at that moment, British novelist Thomas Hardy was expected to win the prize and he did not. And there was this unfounded rumor that the Gitanjali was a production of Yeats, and that was written about. Initially, Yeats was ambivalent about the whole controversy, but later in 1935, he denounced Tagore for his sentimental rubbish. That's one term he uses as a sort of charge against his old friend. This cross-cultural friendship was short-lived and died a sudden death. Given this historical time frame, and the encounter between the East and West, I'm interested in exploring not just the fetishization of Tagore and what kinds of works by him came to be underscored in the Eurocentric imagination, but also the placing of Tagore in this category, dubious category of world literature. What does it mean? Patrick Hogan is deeply critical of such classifications, and he calls it the bias of literary difference, which he argues in which he argues that non-European literature's Indian literature is pushed to the space of otherness. Something that we note in Yeats's preface of Tagore in Gitanjali and in his earlier poetry collection, Crossways. So this is not the first time that Yeats is interested about India or Tagore. Initially in Crossways, he has written about this kind of otherworldliness, ahistoric India in the collection of Crossways. Another question that I'm interested in is whether beyond this commodification of their friendship or literary relationship, beyond the mystic Tagore, do we find any possibilities of dynamic hybridized encounter of the friendship? Derrida, in his Politics of Friendship, points to political potential and possibilities that come from the social bonds of friendship. So there's an aim towards futurity that underlies a vision of friendship, which has a model of inclusivity for him. It can be argued in this framework that Tagore and Yeats perhaps do create some subversive spaces of political anti-colonial inclusivity that lead to many different kinds of collaborations and translations. Yet at a time when colonial Britain affected much of the relationships between East and West, it is also important to note that Yeats's positionality in his friendship with Tagore is not a simple trajectory of colonized Irish and Indian subjects coming together in an anti-colonial vision, nor is it a plain story of colonial encounter, colonized versus the colonizer. Yeats's position is complicated, it's ambiguous, and I'm quoting Jahan Ramazani, who calls Yeats having this kind of liminal space where his relationship with India is not entirely one of affiliation, nor of complete colonial suppression. Anti-colonial resistance against British imperialism certainly brought Indians and Irish together in solidarity. Yet, this friendship becomes tainted with colonial dynamics of power. C.A. Bailey discusses the complex journey of Indian-Irish relationship in the shadow of the British regime. While both were subject to the machinations of colonialism, this is not a simplistic narrative of colonial subjects bonding in their respective colonized experiences. Bailey argues the trajectory of Indo-Irish relation on the British was a complex, non-linear one. While it is easy to put Ireland and India in the same historiographical frame, it is necessary to think of a more ambiguous narrative of Indo-Irish relations that was marred, and this is a quote that Bailey uses, Orientalist anthropology. There was also an imperial stake of many Irishmen carving out careers in the East India Company at administering over Indians. So while Ireland was a subject to British colonialism, at the same time, the position towards India and its people is not just an equivalent comparative one of colonized subjects, one of resistance. Numerous Irish individuals and families who made their fortunes and careers in India during the 18th and 19th century had an ambiguous relationship before an anti-colonial vision was carved out in the Irish and Indian sentiment against empire around the time of the First World War. Seamus Nevin recalls a forgotten piece of history from the infamous Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919. And many of you may know that when General Dyer ordered to open fire and kill hundreds of civilians in Amritsar in the Punjab region in a peaceful protest. An Irish lieutenant governor of Punjab during the time, Michael O'Dwyer, was responsible for the troops who perpetrated the Amritsar massacre at Jallianwala. He was in fact responsible for sending this kind of notorious missive that led to the aerial bombing, machine gunning of men, women, children. Naveen also quotes controversial historian Jane Allmeyer, raising questions of Ireland's colonial memory in the imperial past. Stories like O'Dwyer's challenge, he says, stories like O'Dwyer challenge the master narrative of the Irish as victims of the empire and not active perpetrators. And there has been much debate and even some kinds of attacks on Allmeyer for this controversial argument she makes against the complicit nature of Irish past. Some argue whether Michael O'Dwyer can even be considered Irish in identity. Yet O'Dwyer considered himself an Irish nationalist who argued for Ireland's self-rule, but did not see Indians fit for independence from colonialism. So this kind of space that Ireland has within the imperial discourse becomes fraught with its being European but colonized and having this indeterminate space where Ireland's status, whether it is allied with this or the other, is never really defined. And there's a fascinating work by Julia Wright on India, Ireland, and colonialism to trace this kind of indeterminate space. However, this complicated history is not to suggest in any ways that Yeats was pro-colonialism towards India. Yeats himself was a voice of anti-colonialism against British imperialism and a solidarity with Tagore, and his collaborations and, of course, the initial phase of it speak of the contrary stance. Yet in November 1912, before Tagore catapults to this fame and wins eventually the Nobel, Yeats writes to Edmund Gosse, British poet, for including Tagore in the India Society, stating, and I'm quoting from the letters, "From the English point of view, it would be a fine thing to do, a wise piece of imperialism. For he is worshipped as no poet of Europe is. I believe if we pay him honor, it would be understood that we honor India also," end quote. So this kind of strange, ambiguous colonial history does form a crucial subtext, reading Tagore and Yeats's friendship, one that suffers from ambiguities, entangles with representation, race even, and of course, Orientalist discourses. So what I'm arguing is their friendship is trapped within the colonial logic, a phrase that Gauri Vishwanathan uses elsewhere. Tagore received the Nobel Prize and controversy ensued. After Tagore won the prize, English literary crowds expressed their disappointment, especially due to the fact that celebrated Hardy did not win the prize. And later, Pound wrote in a letter to Iris Barry, the co-founder of the London Film Society, that Tagore's Nobel Prize was a conspiracy and Tagore happened to have ridden a wave of literary boom at the right time. And Yeats, Pound and Tagore's friendship also dies out in a very curious, similar way that happens to Yeats and Tagore. And it's a reminder of these failed collaborations and alliances that were marred by misrepresentations. Tagore himself was deeply disturbed by such reports from the British press and wrote to Rothenstein, and I'm quoting, "Since I have got fame as an English writer, I feel extreme reluctance in accepting alterations in my English poems by any of your writers," end quote. He also added, "I must not give men any reasonable ground for accusing me, which they do, of reaping advantage from other men's genius and skill. It is different about Yeats. I think Yeats was sparing in his suggestions. Moreover, I was with him during the revisions," end quote. And clearly there's this attempt to claim an authorship, his voice. He does not deny Yeats, he gives acknowledgement, and I feel the letter is of appreciation also, but there is a strong element of claiming his voice and that the revisions were done in his presence. Another popular misunderstanding about Tagore's Nobel is that only his English translations of the Gitanjali, aided or done, however we put it, is the reason that he got the Nobel Prize. A study of the Nobel Committee's criteria for Tagore's award in 1913 reveals, and I actually had the chance to look at the Nobel registers in Stockholm, which are for public view, and it says one of the Swedish committee members, Isaiah Tenier Jr., could in fact read Tagore in Bengali. 3 works in Bengali, Naivedya Kya and Gitamallo, were received by the Nobel Literary Library on 18 July 1913, before the award was given. Michael Collins' fantastic work on this Nobel controversy also shows that, and I'm quoting Collins, from an investigation of the Ascensions Register, we learned that Tenier actually borrowed 3 Bengali texts mentioned above in August 1913. In 1913, the speech given by then chairman of the Nobel Committee, Harold Hearn, states, quoting, Gitanjali was only one of Tagore's works that especially arrested the attention of the selecting critics, but he also mentions Gardner, Lyrics of Love and Life, that came before the committee. So it is particularly important that the Nobel Committee had access to the original Bengali works beyond Gitanjali, and it sort of takes away the focus of what we see as the translation of Gitanjali that brought the Nobel Prize. There are 2 ways of seeing this friendship. One in which post-colonial friendships emerge from affective communities, a phrase used by Leela Gandhi, in which new alignments are possible and blur the static identity positions of East and West, colonizer, colonized, that Derrida also talks about. Gandhi warns against this kind of binary dialectic of colonial relations that are always locked into us versus them, and instead she wants to look beyond this cross-cultural collaborations between oppressor and oppressed. And there are other friendships like that come to mind. There's Annie Besant, born to Irish parents, Sister Nivedita, born to Ireland, who form important spiritual and political alliances, and they have their experiences within India that cross these kinds of borders towards hybrid associations, fruitful ones. But the second approach that Gandhi is mentioning is a far trickier one, which is not to return to the static East and West binary positionalities and create beyond the divide positionalities. In the context of Tagore and Yeats, this, I contend, is tragically under a colonial limitation. Iqbal also asks an important question: how can friendship help us think about knowledge as being produced not by learning about, but by learning from? And Bal is interested in the idea of an intellectual friendship and the space of teaching and reading itself, which she defines as space of critical intimacy that she borrows from Spivak. And according to her, a definition of friendship is knowledge production, and how one learns from each other in the process of the space of critical intimacy, which teaches. And critical intimacy between Yeats and Tagore seems to be taken over by these colonial imaginations and stops a flow of teaching and learning that initially inspired the 2 writers. In a recent book, critical race theorists John Zosky and Shannon Walsh, in a title called Ties That Bind, argue that interracial friendship across color and cultures have the ability to create spaces of power and resistance. Their work actually valorizes this kind of interracial friendship as a way to drive power relations, solidarities, and resistance in various different ways. For them, friendship can transcend spheres of politics. Friendships can crystallize almost instantly both practices that resist structures of oppression and those that enable them, intimacies and complicities. They claim that friendship can become a liberal colonial power while holding on to possibilities for insurgent, transgressive, and subversive friendships. And most importantly, their work also brings into a space of a return to race and its production through the lived experiences of evolving subjectivities. In a way, this material space highlights the encounter between Yeats and Tagore and defines their stultified relationship. My remembering of Yeats and Tagore and their journey is not about feeling an impossibility towards crossing boundaries. Rather, it is a remembering of history and its problems of representation that enables evaluation of power structures and colonial narratives to rethink the present. Here, I want to pause and go into the second half quickly. I just want to know from Professor Kashyap if I have about 15 minutes or so.
Yes, that's right. Also, Amrita, would you be careful with the papers? It's creating a lot of noise around the mics. I think something.
Okay. Thank you for telling me. Thank you. So in the second half, I want to talk about how we can see some kind of collaborations in rethinking Eurocentric modernisms by Tagore and Yeats, albeit I'm not comparing their work with each other, but in different locations and different spaces. As I mentioned before, over 2,000 paintings by Tagore exist. Ignored, not enough attention have been paid to them. Tagore was a on the time. This is from 1905, and this is by Tagore's nephew, Abanindranath Tagore, who actually became this spokesperson for the Bengal School of Art with his brother Gogendranath. And they created these paintings that would be initiating nationalist thought and fervor in a kind of anti-colonial vision towards fighting against colonialism. And Bengal School of Art flourished in early 20th century Bengal and quickly spread to the Indian subcontinent. And I'm showing this to show how different it was from what Tagore creates eventually thereafter, critiquing some of the things in the socio-political climate. But I want to situate Tagore and Yeats in a kind of modernism that already has gone within the field, a shift in thinking, with its question and relationship with the colonized world. Simon Gikkandi's absolutely important work, Modernism in the World, explains that modernism perhaps represents the most intense and unprecedented site of encounter between institutions of European cultural production and cultural practices of colonized peoples. And this relationship between the institution of modernism and other cultural spaces is dynamic, dialectical, and constitutes the field of European American culture in a completely different way. And there are some of the other very important works in this kind of rethinking modernism, which is Laura Doyle and Laura Winkle's replacing the term modernism by calling it geomodernism. And there's alternate modernisms that are being talked about more and more within the field. So I situate Tagore and his understudied artworks within this planetary modernisms or geomodernisms. A quick word on Indian art, even before the Bengal School of Art. At the beginning of the 18th century, it was usurped. So roughly, very quickly, around the 9th and 10th century onwards, the Indian art had a massive history, something called miniature paintings, where there were different schools of miniature paintings from Mughal history in Rajasthan, in various different areas that had these fascinating art coming out in small little depictions of Indian life. This got usurped in the 18th century, in the heydays of colonialism, that came to be known as company paintings. And in the company paintings, the use of oil and easel emerged with English painters like Joshua Reynolds and William Daniel, who came to India to gain a fortune. And they suddenly get interested in what is happening in the native life, in the princely courts, and a different kind of painting starts getting growing and flourishing, through firstly a district in West Bengal, Murshidabad, and later to other parts of the British Raj. In 1878, Rudyard Kipling's father, John Lockwood Kipling, established the Mayo School of Arts in Lahore. The company paintings then were created by Indian artists, but soon it changed it towards patronage for the Europeans who wanted these arts. The paintings were in hybrid Indo-European style, blending Mughal and Rajput style paintings, but were characteristically Western from the lens and the perspective. Most paintings were on paper, but many were on ivory. And of course, we can understand this kind of colonial consumption through these mechanisms of how these paintings grew. The Bengal School of Art, though, was different. It was not free from the colonial derivative, but it wanted to promote and get associated with a more nationalist fervor, as I mentioned in this particular very famous art images that gets associated called Mother India, Bharat Mata. And it's iconic because it reminds of the Swadeshi movement, which is my country, reject all British goods, and we create our own system, our structure, our goods, and so on and so forth. This painting, meant to invoke a certain nationalist effect, obviously has these tropes of gendering the nation. Tagore's own journey around the same time in 1916 had a profound impact on him and led to envision a new style of art. He was not very keen on this kind of nationalist art or the Swadeshi movement getting associated with the School of Art. And this kind of history or the brief backdrop is important to contextualize what Tagore's art historian, he's actually one of the key ones, Raman Sivakumar, who talks about Tagore's modernism as contextual modernism. So why do I then use this word as grotesque modernism? Now, Tagore's art was they're famously suddenly discovered in a notebook of doodles by someone named Victoria Ocampo, who arranged for an exhibition in Paris in 1930. And his body of works consists of faces, of animals, of imaginary architecture, including this very famous human and creature, not very sure what that is. Some people call it a humanoid, some people call it a merger of human and the animal. So there's a surreal abstractness of his work. So we saw the Rothenstein representation of Tagore, and now we see some of the art by him. This is Tagore's self-representation of himself. This was done in 1935. This is also from his self-portrait series. So we can see there's this kind of a complete, not just alternative way of representing himself, but it's fragmented, it's abstract, it's grotesque. There's this darkness about this, about his images. So after having series of exhibitions in New York, Toronto, Philadelphia, Berlin, Munich, Dresden, what have you, Moscow even, Tagore's art suddenly gained attention at a later stage in life. The immediate reactions, though, were that it is derived from European classic modernism. The German Vossische Zeitung, a popular journal, calls him particularly like Munch or Knoll. Sometimes he's compared to Klee. Sometimes he's compared to this Art Nouveau movement artist named Adolf Hölzel. So all of these comparisons start situating him in a kind of a symptomatic colonial, Eurocentric modernist derivative. These images that I'm about to show you come from a collection named Behind the Veil, curated by Rajat Kantare. And I want you to see the very sort of aura and the broodingness that these images, especially the depiction of women in these images, I'm really interested about. So I'm quickly going to go down the slides and we can stop at what I want to talk about. The aura is dark and brooding, pair of striking eyes, sometimes reflecting sadness in some of the images of women. It is subversively grotesque against the mainstream art that is going on in the time period. And the mainstream art, if I have shown you the Swadeshi Bengal School of Art in 1905, that went for a couple of more years, definitely another 5 to 7 years. Here's the other extreme of Tagore, of the time period artist in 1930, at the same time that Tagore was drawing those very grotesque images. This is the other kind of opposite from the spiritual mother of the nation to celebrating the body or the femininity in erotic images of the woman. And I actually like him in Mazumdar a lot. This one is called the Likaladdu, or in translation, Object of Desire. But he was also resisting this kind of backlash from the Christian propaganda or the British colonials that Hindu images of women have too much eroticism and sensuality and have to be curbed down. So he is doing a certain kind of resistance in his portrayal, and almost brings in this new depiction of women in their intimate moments and focusing on their bodies. But Tagore's women, if we go back to some of the images that I showed you, and we will see some of them more, are not the spiritual goddess of the nation, nor is it this feminine depiction of erotic bodies, but somewhere in between. So I'm interested in looking at this term, grotesque modernism. And I borrow the concept from, well, the concept of grotesque, not grotesque modernism. Justine Edwards and Rune Growland, in their book called Grotesque, coined the phrase grotesquerie. And they say that this is a concept that challenges authority, stability, opens up a possibility of various kinds, can be harnessed as a powerful force to resist tools of normalization of bodies, of subjectivities, of genders, in various different ways. So it cannot be locked into a meaning of one thing or the other, or one form or the other, in a historical period. If there is one thing that defines the grotesque, according to them, it is this transgressive, but always in motion. And I find the art in the images of women, and also the self-portraits, in this kind of dynamism and movement. Grotesque also emerged in this idea of transgressive element merging the human on animal. The idea of feminine body is not anymore the product of male gaze, but it is subverted by a grotesque female imagination that I want to associate with Tagore. In one of the paintings that I'm going to quickly start wrapping up, so I go to Yeats's collaborations also. This is something that I want to stay focused on. This is from 1928, and the red sari is iconic and symbolic of a bride. So it appears to have a bride sitting surrounded in darkness, staring back at the gazer. The eyes are really prominent. If I don't know if you can see it clearly, the eyes are really dominant. She's dressed in red, reminiscent of bridal clothing. The face of the woman is not visible. The eyes are somewhat visible, but piercing in this darkness. But also there's this strange notion of horror. It's a pretty grotesque image of the bride, and not celebrating of joyousness or wholesomeness. Some of these faces that I have just shown you are also devoid of expression. Some are staring in an emptiness, sometimes with a searching look. In another particular painting, it's called Waterproof, from 1935, and this is the one. This is the one that gets spoken about as what exactly is it? It seems like the same kind of posture of the bride, but suddenly it is fused into this snake-like creature coiled in. And once again, the face is hardly visible. The eyes are still there, discomforting. And there's this aura of some kind of movement, but discomfort. Tagore's art presents an anti-essentialist view of seeing, and also questioning colonialist anthropocentrism. The painting of the woman fused with the animal poses larger questions of ontology and hierarchy of the human and the non-human. And I'm here again thinking of Derrida's the animal that therefore I am, and in which I'm not going to get into details, we can talk about it later, but this hierarchy of the human and the non-human subject, and what is it to understand as an animal is being questioned by Derrida So it also questions tropes of otherness and inclusion through our ways of seeing. So Tagore's modernist art then has a larger trajectory in his own imagination towards a contextual alternate modernism. And he was extremely critical of Western modernism, by the way, around the same time period in 1970s and 20s. So his art dismantles normative ideas of linearity, progress, gender portrayals, assumed boundaries, and ultimately challenge established thinking. Now, if we have that kind of backdrop with Tagore, I will wrap up with a final focus on one play by Yeats in 1916 called At the Hawk's Well. Many of you Yeats scholars might know this really well. In 1916, however, something fascinating happens. Yeats collaborates with Japanese dancer and choreographer Michio Ito on the one-act play, aesthetically styled as a dance drama, At the Hawk's Well, written by Yeats. And I focus on this collaboration. I don't know if you can see my screen because my screen is kind of hidden by all the Zoom participants, but I hope you can see this fascinating mask and Michio Ito's face in it. So I focus on this collaboration and connect it to Tagore's art in very fascinating ways that demand our attention and what's going on with the ideas of body, of androgyny, gender questions, and so forth. At the Hawk's Well deserves special note because aesthetically, it is the first time in 1916 that it uses elements of Japanese no theater, Bengali folk music, and Bengali theater. With origins in the 13th and 14th century, no theater is one of the classic Japanese styles of dance drama that then Yeats incorporates and presents tales of ancient literature consisting of supernatural beings into human forms. Sometimes the narratorial devices are spoken by some other beings, not by humans, as we see that happens in the play. No theater is also important because it makes use of masks, musicians, dancers as a part of the repertory. Dance involved within Yeats as a mode to experiment with forms of writing and movement, perhaps an early emergence of intermediality of genres and forms. And what do I mean by that concept of intermediality? The word intermedial basically means a phenomenon by which one medium takes on or is integrated with another or the qualities of another. So there are these collaborations between different mediums and creating sites of entanglement, expanding and breaking boundaries towards alternative meaning making. And what happens in this collaboration is also fascinatingly reminiscent of Tagore and Yeats. In 1916, there is another Michio Ito evening, so much reminiscent of 1912, when with the patronage of Lady Ottilie Morrell, a private party is organized, Michio Ito is discovered, once again, quote unquote, and there is Ezra Pound, Yeats, Thomas Sturge Moore, and suddenly Ito becomes the toast of London society. And not unlike Tagore's exotic entry into the London circuit, Ito too is represented within this kind of Oriental fare. Yet he claims, and this interview comes out soon enough, my dancing is not Japanese, he claims. It is not anything. It is only myself. Yeats' collaboration with Ito then does two things. First, it creates a unique space for dance movement and theatricality to posit alternate imaginations for body presence. Secondly, the creation of the fused animal and the human once again creates different modalities of being a reminder of the Tagore human and the beast form. Like Tagore's grotesque modernism, the inclusion of the dance at the Hawk's Well, and there's this, if I can show you one more image, this is Ito literally in the moment of dancing around the well. He is the figure of the guardian in the play, and he's dancing around the well. Actually, there are these studies where Ito and Yeats go on for days to the London Zoo just to observe the behaviors and the movements of hawks, and that then gets incorporated within this particular play and the performativity of it. So it creates alternate identities of human, non-human, fused together to question static ideas of gender, human body, boundaries between human and non-human animal. The guardian of the well, Monsieur Ito, is a strange, grotesque human bird, much like one of the paintings that we saw. Actually, one of the paintings that I could not find, it's again within that scanned collection of Behind the Veil. It is a bird fused into a human. And I could not scan that. So it has these fascinating intersections between both of these sort of modernist tendencies. Yeats's earlier dance, so this is not the first time Yeats is using dance in his work. Yeats's earlier dance had the depiction of fairy queens, Gaelic folklore, divinity, Siddhe, that becomes significant in narrating this kind of Irish past and recreating Irish mythology, femininity, and tradition. But later, this vision that we see in 1916 shifts to this very different kind of embodiment that is experimental. It has these various different mediums working together. And if we think about intermediality, it's Patrick Millian has a fascinating work discussing intermedial works, and he calls it, and he mentions that his work actually covers dancer Louis Filler, artist Florence Stettheimer, and he briefly in the passing mentions that Yeats's dance should be also, work on dance should be also covered in intermedial, but not much work is done on it. So as I wrap up, I just contend that Yeats's collaboration with Monsieur Ito's dance intersects in this evolving of theater, emerges the first notions of intermedial modernist dance theater that has similar intersections with Tagore. Ito's hybrid dance has no characteristics with androgynous elements, subversive possibility for Yeats that later pushed questions of theater itself, visual arts, and also audience and actors to a certain space, and that had a powerful life. There was this electric element in this performance. What then it creates is evolving myriad worlds and techniques through this particular play. Louis Blackney Williams also has a fascinating study, and she calls it a cosmopolitan dance theater that is evolving. And she especially focuses on the use of Bengali folk theater and music in this particular play at the Hawk's Well. The music of the play is again fused in different kinds of elements of genre and intermixing of intercultural moments. Tagore's music was known to Yeats, that Williams says that was incorporated within this play. And it also had distinct notions of merging Greek, Egyptian, and Asian influences. The Yeats-Ito collaboration thus opens up fascinating intersections across multiple geographical spaces, not only challenging Western modernism, but also helping us see new configuration that broadens these scopes of contextual and alternate modernisms. And finally, located within this kind of geomodernisms, I situate Tagore's modernist trend as this grotesque modernism and Yeats's intermediate modernism, both in this fascinating performativity that critiques questions of gender, questions of human subjectivity, but also locating a fusion of the East and the West, and makes us wonder if this friendship was in fact not so fruitful. But we can begin with such questions as we take into the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita Ghosh. That was a lovely talk. And coming from Assam, Tagore is one of the tallest figures. No doubt he's in India, but also in Assam, because we read Bengali very well and his songs are very popular. So this is a new territory for me, of course. And at the same time, as the people in Assam have an ambivalent relationship with Tagore. Actually, I think we can talk about it sometime. But generally, like his relationship with Northeast India was not seen as very flattering sometimes. but people admire him a lot, but will have these problems. Anyway, I was thinking some of the things as you were presenting, and I noted down a few things as people gather their thoughts to ask questions. I thought I would sort of go ahead and ask the first question. So I request the people on Zoom to post their chat, and when I ask them, they can read out their question, post their question on the chat, and when their turn comes, they can read out their questions. It would be nice to see your face. And people in the postcolonial literature class downstairs, they can come near the computer and ask the question, and we will welcome questions that way. You talk a lot about you mentioned Leela Gandhi, Leela Gandhi's effective communities, and where one must look beyond the binary dialectic of colonial relations that are always locked into as us versus them, instead of focus on cross-cultural collaborations, And so reading Tagore and Yeats's friendship, do you then completely erase any such cross-cultural alliance between them?
Wow, that is a great question. That is, there are a couple of things that come to mind, and yes and no. So, for instance, the initial friendship, and I do see that when they met, and there are many scholars, post-colonial scholars who talk about this, that, okay, there's self-fashioning in Tagore too. If you really look at it in his fascinating play Post Office, that then gets translated and is performed at the Abbey Theatre, and then has its own afterlife in various different kinds of moments, and very important political questions come out of it, being performed in the Warsaw Ghetto and so on. Tagore himself performed the sage, the saint, the fakir. So, and also there are works on Tagore's moment in entry in the London circuit. Perhaps he also dwelled in this kind of self-representation. So I think Tagore was hungry enough to gain a certain kind of international clout. His relationship, as you mentioned, Northeast India. Within India, it wasn't as cult-like or celebrity status-like as we have now in post-colonial India or post the Nobel Prize. He had an ambiguous relationship. I mean, here we are looking at a family and a writer from the wealthiest of the wealthiest echelons. And culturally, they are different. They are meddling with the British. I mean, literally, Tagore's grandfather is considered the first industrialist, and he has these hobnobbing moments with creating, steam engines and having businesses with the indigo workers. So there's a problematic, ambiguous relationship with empire. But having said that, I think your question is an important one, because it also brings us back to the way Yeats thinks about two things. Yeats thinks about Tagore in the Gitanjali. It is a very reductive work. And in the book that is coming out, one of the most fascinating things that Amardeep Singh does is he situates the preface as, can we read the preface as a separate text altogether? And what happens when we do that? What is the preface doing in prefacing Gitanjali? And to him, it does the work of not only reduction, but also telling the readers for the first time who Tagore is and how we should read him. So in a way, that is a misrepresentation. It's a problematic kind of alliance. Right. But also thinking about Yeats' self-fashioning, we don't really spend so much time, because we constantly think about how Yeats has represented Tagore, but not think about how Yeats forayed into the British literary circuit himself sometime back in the late 1880s. I think it was 1887 or 88, when he uses his father's art as Mat Kingo, this kind of Celtic reproduction of Orientalism, as himself. And then he is reproduced, his poem with this particular image is reproduced and printed in Leisure Hour, classic British readership, where he chooses to represent himself in this very Orientalized light. And so there's these complicit moments where both the writers are trying to gain some kind of literary attention gains through that kind of orientalizing, I think. So I don't think that we can ignore. But yes, there is this reduction. And obviously later what happens and how Yeats posits himself, saying that this is a wise piece of imperialism, those are kind of damning telltale signs that the alliances that are beyond the East and the West are not happening, or they fall apart. So it's an ambiguous midway, I would think. That's a great question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There is Dr. Arnav Roy, a friend from Florida Gulf Coast University, professor of English. Please, Arnav, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, that was a great talk. I mean, I loved every second of it. Thank you for this illuminating session. I mean, I felt like, I mean, what was particularly interesting about like how you situate the tensions, right? Like between Yeats and Tagore, like not like necessarily classifying it as something that was entirely negative or something that led to like just like devolved, right? That many people have, right? Like he was, but like you do also see certain like redeeming potentials in that relationship, like in the way even like Yeats's work got influence, right? Like even if he didn't want it to be, right? Like Tagore did figure in Yeats's works later on, as your work on his modernism reveals. So I mean, I'm fascinated by this, and I was like thinking whether you've like identified similar tensions in Tagore's friendship with a lot of other folks, right? Like he had a lot of different friendships, right? Like with Victoria Ocampo, with C.F. Andrews, with Gandhi in a more like local and nationalist scale. Like, so I just was like curious about that.
I think that's another absolutely brilliant question. And to be honest, and I think I start this presentation with the fact that me and my co-writer slash editor, Dr. Redwine, we were in Colorado, and she's an Irish studies scholar, Yeats specialist. And we were both in this conference, not really talking about Yeats and Tagore. And what happened is that she mentioned Yeats about Easter 1916 and how it gets co-opted in very different ways. And I was talking about Tagore and how he gets co-opted. And then their friendship came into space. And the questions from the audience were about, but you know, who is Tagore? I mean, that became a kind of way to get into this idea of working on a relationship about what does it mean to be a world literature or a part of world literature? And what does it mean to be W.B. Yeats as this classic modernist writer that we all read in all kinds of academic / required courses and so on. So that was the entry to this. But as you mentioned, this is absolutely important and key because you mentioned Pound and Gandhi and problematic relationships or somewhat ambiguous relationships with C.F. Andrews, then the first biography by Thompson on Tagore, which is also problematic in so many different ways. I'm also interested in his complete falling with Pound. We don't know much about it. His falling with Yone Noguchi, that kind of, sorry, I'm echoing to myself.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
So this kind of relationship with Yone Noguchi, in that what starts off it as a fantastic critique of nationalism, but then falls apart into political misalignment. So I think Tagore is a fascinating figure with so many different friendships, you're right. And the friendship with Gandhi in your question is an important one. It is very complicated from what I have read. I have not worked on this. This book, as I said, is just on these two big stalwarts of literature in ways that Nobel Prize gets situated. And 10 years down the line, Yeats would have his Nobel also. And I think that complicates the relationship further, who gets what first. So Gandhi's relationship with Tagore has been written about fantastic book, if I can recall the name, by Madhumita Lahiri, called Imperfect Solidarities. It's with Tagore and W.B. Du Bois, Gandhi. So, you know, Tagore has this very interesting, he's very unlike Gandhi in his visions about where India should be in the anti-colonial struggle, or how he locates nationalism. He's against Gandhi's spinning of the wheel that will lift us out of colonialism into future. So and yet he's the one who calls Gandhi Mahatma, the father of the nation. So there's this very complicit, curious friendship also there. But this book absolutely has no sort of entry into those friendships. And I think there's space for volume 2, 3, Pound, and Victoria Campbell has not been talked about, absolutely, who does this fascinating work on the paintings and art.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have a question from the postcolonial literature class. Ezra Santos would like to ask a question, and any students who would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Amrita, for that wonderful presentation. As I mentioned before, here in this class, we talk about borders, and one of the great takeaways from your lecture was the way you talked about these cross-cultural friendships, how they, in a way, bring about these entanglements and intermedial kinds of expressions, as you looked at the self and the other, East and West. But I'm really wondering about if we could perhaps bring it back to the idea of genre a little bit. I'm not a Tagore specialist, but I read a lot of his poems and a couple of his novels, but I wasn't very familiar with his paintings before this. And it really made me think about, like, there's a whole new Tagore that I haven't even known before. But this difference between his aesthetic sentiment in terms of writing, and for me, his writing is very modernist, it's very structured, it's very much complicit in this nation building process. There are all these social aspects, that it's like a social undertaking. It is involved with like the post-colonial project of, in a way, of finding form, finding Indian voice, as opposed to these paintings. When I look at them, they are kind of anti-form. They're almost like this shapeless impressionist, again, formless things. And I was just wondering how genre, in a way, defines this border between writing and representing visually, and what the artistic sentiment is behind it when it tends to be quite schizophrenic. Like it's almost like two different people involved in these two different kinds of aesthetic expressions. So I wonder if you had anything to say about that. Or...
I think it's a brilliant question, something that I have not thought about, but the way that you really structured the question itself makes me think about Tagore, the writer, Tagore, the artist, Tagore, the political philosopher, social philosopher, the spiritual thinker. So there are so many different Tagores. There's this multiplicit kind of nature of Tagore's. But I'm also thinking of something that came by not too long ago in a conversation. And this was within West Bengal, and, you know, scholars of Bengali who read Tagore in Bengali, they claimed him as Tagore the classic. He's the classic writer. He's not a modernist, he's a classicist. And whereas when I'm reading Tagore, and I do read Bangla, but when I'm mostly reading in translation, the poems or the plays, I find a modernist Tagore, and I agree, there's this, you know, kind of slipping of genres and or the writer himself. But I'm also wondering, as we locate or try to think about Tagore's writings and the genre that he's writing in, there is some kind of interesting pushing of the genre that he's doing, where, for example, he innovates this whole dance drama theater, Nritya Natya, which is building on this kind of intermediality, if you will, with the song, with the dance, and creating this whole play through it, the theater. And Tagore's work should be performed. I think William Radice says that very famously in What Happens to Next 50 Years of Tagore, that Tagore can be located in his performances and what people do with his work. So I think there's the slipping of the genres even in his writing, that kind of we don't look at so much. And again, it brings us to the question that you really asked: who is Tagore and what Tagore are we reading, and on whose Tagore are we reading, right? That's a great question. With the art specifically, you know, it is that kind of shock that from Gitanjali that wins the 1912, the sage-like quality of spiritual unity coming forth, to this complete subversion of in every possible way. You're absolutely right. And I think I would say that there is this shifting of Tagore that happens from the 1912s as we move on to the 1935 to 38 as this really more, I say, radical and, you know, with a voice against what is happening in the world in terms of the war, in terms of capitalist encroachment. And also he's getting more and more really demoralized with the kind of Hindu-Muslim fractions that he's seeing within the country. He was very against that. So everything that he says before has kind of dwindled into this kind of art that is coming out. I feel that's a shock, challenging everything that kind of essentially is cultural knowledge at this point. But that's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? We are 2 minutes ahead of time, but any students from the class would like to ask a question, they're welcome. But this has been a great conversation.
It really has been.
Okay, thank you so much. Then if there is no other question, thank you, Dr. Sanderson, for hosting Amrita virtually. And thank you, Amrita, for making your time. It must be very late in Sweden right now.
It's not so late, it's just 9:15-ish, but I have to say, if I can, just 1 minute, that this conversation has been tremendous. And I especially thank you all for waiting for that longest time. And this has been great. I wish we could meet in person, but I think I will meet some of you very soon.
Well, now that you are in Florida, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely, you're a drive away. So again, congratulations also on the new job.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting me in your class, Professor Santoso. That is a real honor for me.
Our pleasure.
Thank you all. And with this, we come to an end to the English Department lecture series. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today.
Bye.
Bye.